Have you ever looked into the eyes of the man you loved and realized he was bleeding you dry? The freezing rain that night did not just soak my rescue dog, it washed away the final mask of a rotting marriage. The most dangerous enemies do not carry guns. They wear wedding rings. It took exactly 48 hours to forge my remaining patience into a devastating weapon, bringing a traitor to his knees in his own driveway. Welcome back to Violet Revenge Stories, my wonderful listeners. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to sustain their livelihoods and continue bringing these stories to you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. My name is Brinley Diaz, and this is my story. The exhaustion was not just in my bones, it was woven into the very fabric of my muscles, a heavy, suffocating weight that dragged at my limbs with every step. I was returning to my suburban house in Portland after a grueling 21-day deployment in the eye of a hurricane devastation zone with the Apex Crisis Response Initiative. For 3 straight weeks, my world had been a chaotic blur of shattered drywall, rising floodwaters, and the desperate cries of stranded families. I smelled of stagnant mud, heavy chemical disinfectants, and the sour tang of prolonged fear. My uniform was stiff with dried grime, and my boots felt like blocks of solid concrete. Walking beside me was Titan, my partner, my shadow. He is a 100-pound German Shepherd, a certified canine search and rescue specialist who had spent the last 3 weeks digging through collapsed rooftops to pull buried survivors from the rubble. His paws were raw. His fur was matted with the same toxic sludge that coated my uniform, and his amber eyes carried the same profound, hollow fatigue that mirrored my own. We had saved lives. We had witnessed death. All I wanted, the only thing keeping me upright on the front porch, was the promise of a hot shower, a quiet room, and the comforting embrace of the man I had married 5 years ago. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open, the howling wind and driving rain immediately attempting to follow us inside. The house was immaculate, suffocatingly pristine, smelling of expensive vanilla diffusers and artificial perfection. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the disaster zone I had just left. Standing in the center of the foyer was my husband, Vance. He was wearing a freshly pressed cashmere sweater and holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. There was no sigh of relief escaping his lips. There were no open arms rushing to pull me into a tight embrace. There was not even a basic inquiry about whether I was hurt or simply glad to be alive. Instead, his gaze swept over me and settled on Titan. His features twisted into a visceral mask of utter disgust, his upper lip curling as if we were a pair of stray vermin tracking disease into his sanctuary. Titan, exhausted and shivering from the sudden drop in temperature, took 2 heavy, clumsy steps forward. His damp paws pressed down onto a brand-new, absurdly expensive white sheepskin rug that Vance had apparently purchased while I was away risking my life. A faint, muddy imprint was left behind on the immaculate fluff. It was a tiny smudge of dirt, a trivial blemish, but to Vance, it was an unforgivable crime. Before I could even open my mouth to apologize or command Titan to sit back, Vance lunged forward. His hand shot out, his fingers curling aggressively around Titan's tactical collar. With a sudden vicious surge of strength fueled by pure, unadulterated malice, he yanked the exhausted German Shepherd sideways. Titan let out a sharp, confused yelp, his tired legs slipping on the polished hardwood floor. "Vance, stop it!" I shouted, the rawness in my throat tearing at my vocal cords. My hand instinctively reached out to intervene, but the heavy fatigue in my muscles made me agonizingly slow. Vance ignored me completely. He dragged the 100-pound hero dog across the foyer, shoved the front door wide open, and delivered a brutal, unhesitating kick to Titan's ribcage. The force of the blow sent Titan tumbling out onto the hard concrete porch, right into the teeth of the freezing torrential downpour. I froze. The breath left my lungs in a violent rush. My mind snapped, struggling to process the sheer, unprovoked cruelty I had just witnessed. Vance slammed the heavy door half shut, leaving just enough space to sneer at me. His eyes were cold, completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. He leveled his index finger at my face and spat out his words with a chilling, calculated arrogance. "This house is mine. You and this filthy dog have no right to speak. Learn some respect for my property, or you can sleep out there with the mutt." He was standing in a house where I paid the mortgage. He was drinking liquor bought with my paycheck. He was living a life fully subsidized by my grueling labor. Yet in his mind, he was the absolute monarch, and I was merely an annoying peasant dirtying his royal floors. There was a moment where the old Brinley might have screamed. I might have dropped my bags, cried out in betrayal, and argued with him until my voice gave out. I might have begged for basic human decency, but standing there, staring at the man whose ring I wore on my finger, I felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no sorrow, only a profound, chilling clarity. A deadly silence wrapped around me. I did not utter a single word in response. I simply turned on my heel, stepped backward through the doorway, and pulled the door shut between us with a quiet, definitive click. I walked out into the blinding, freezing rain. Titan was huddled against the brick wall, shivering violently, his loyal eyes looking up at me in total confusion. I dropped to my knees in the puddles, wrapped my arms around his wet, trembling body, and buried my face in his damp fur. I whispered a soft apology against his ear. Then, I stood up, gripped his leash, and led him toward my heavy-duty work vehicle parked at the curb. I climbed into the driver's seat, cranked the heater to the maximum setting, and put the car in drive. As the windshield wipers slashed violently against the driving rain, I steered away from the manicured lawn and the pristine house. I did not look back. At that exact moment, watching the house fade into the rearview mirror, my marriage officially flatlined. The grief was gone. Only the cold, mechanical calculus of destruction remained. I drove straight to the 24-hour veterinary clinic managed by Marcus, a former combat medic who now ran logistics for our response team. I led Titan through the glass doors. Marcus took one look at my hardened expression, then at the shivering, mud-soaked dog, and asked absolutely no questions. He just gave a firm nod, wrapped Titan in a heavy thermal mylar blanket, and guided him into the heated observation ward. I did not follow them inside. I needed total isolation to think. I retreated to the cab of my command vehicle, the rain still drumming a relentless metallic beat against the steel roof. The heater blasted dry air over my damp uniform, but my mind was entirely iced over. In my line of work, when a Category 5 hurricane obliterates a coastline, you do not sit in the wreckage and cry over splintered wood. You establish a perimeter. You conduct a systematic damage assessment. You identify the active hazards. My marriage was no longer a relationship. It was a disaster zone, and Vance was the primary biological hazard. I reached into my tactical bag, pulled out my rugged field laptop, and flipped the screen open. It was time to map the wreckage. 8 months ago, Vance had complained about the home security cameras glitching and confidently declared the entire system permanently fried. He possessed the ego of a tech mogul, but lacked the basic technical competence to realize I had simply rerouted the primary feed to a secure, off-site cloud server, entirely bypassing the main console in his office. I logged into the encrypted interface, the dashboard instantly populated with dozens of thumbnail videos. I did not search blindly. I applied a chronological filter, working backward from the exact hour I deployed 3 weeks prior. It took exactly 14 minutes of reviewing high-speed playback to uncover the first structural failure of his lies. The footage from the living room camera, dated 2 days after my departure, showed Vance swaggering through the front door. He was not alone. Clinging to his arm was a woman who looked barely 25 years old, wearing sharp stilettos and carrying a flashy designer handbag. I zoomed in on her face, cross-referencing her features with my memory. I recognized her vaguely from a massive billboard near the highway. Chloe, a junior real estate agent who specialized in selling fake luxury lifestyles to gullible, wealthy clients. I sat in the dark truck and watched them drink my expensive wine. I watched them laugh on the custom sofa I had purchased with my hazard pay. I watched them head upstairs toward the master bedroom. There was no sudden sting of heartbreak. The physiological response in my body was completely flat, a straight horizontal line on an emotional heart monitor. Watching Vance fumble with Chloe was like observing a stranger commit a minor traffic violation. It was pathetic, mundane, and entirely predictable. Infidelity is cheap. It is the lowest form of betrayal. I needed to know if he had compromised my operational security and my financial perimeter. I closed the video feed and launched my secure browser, accessing our shared household email account. Vance operated under the assumption that I never checked the digital mail when I was on active deployment. The main inbox was a carefully curated, boring list of utility bills and marketing junk. It was too clean. I bypassed the primary folder and navigated directly to the deleted items and the deep spam directory. There it was, a digital paper trail of absolute financial treason. A series of automated alerts from a major national bank sat quietly hidden in the digital trash. The subject lines referenced a high-yield home equity line of credit. I opened the PDF attachments one by one, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the cold precision of a bomb technician reading a complex circuit schematic. The property we lived in was not jointly owned. I had inherited the estate entirely from my late grandfather, long before Vance and I had ever met at the altar. My name was the only one on the deed. Yet staring back at me from the glowing screen was a highly detailed, legally binding mortgage application. At the bottom of the final page, executed via a remote digital notary service, was my signature. It was an excellent forgery, clearly practiced over many hours, but a blatant felony nonetheless. Vance had weaponized my absence. He had illegally leveraged my inherited family home to secure a massive loan without my knowledge. The principal amount printed in bold ink on the approval document made my jaw lock tight. $150,000. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the loan dispersal date with Vance's recent public social media activity. I navigated to his profile, a page he treated like a daily shrine to his non-existent business acumen. His latest post, uploaded just 5 days ago, featured a high-resolution photograph of him leaning casually against the hood of a sleek, absurdly expensive McLaren sports car. The caption read, "Hard work pays off. The next chapter of the startup journey begins now." He was playing the role of a venture capital visionary, using stolen funds to buy a 6-figure prop for his delusional digital theater. He had not just cheated on me with a cheap agent. He had attempted to steal my foundation. He had tied a massive, illegal financial anchor to my neck while I was miles away pulling corpses out of toxic floodwaters. I closed the laptop screen. The soft click echoed loudly in the quiet cab of the truck. The damage assessment was complete. The threat was identified, quantified, and isolated. Now it was time to initiate the containment protocol. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a secure number I had not called in over 2 years. It belonged to Elias, a brilliant former forensic accountant for the federal government who now handled high-level logistics and background investigations for our crisis initiative. He answered on the third ring, his voice slightly groggy from sleep. "Elias, I need a rapid financial extraction," I said, my voice completely devoid of any inflection. "It is 3 o'clock in the morning," Elias replied, the sleep instantly vanishing from his tone, replaced by sharp focus. "Give me the target parameters." "Vance," I stated simply. He forged my signature on a property loan for $150,000. The funds were dispersed into an account he controls. I need you to quietly trace the routing numbers, identify every secondary account he has linked to that stolen money, and prepare the documentation to freeze his assets through the federal fraud department the second the banks open. I want every single exit door locked shut before he even wakes up. Consider it done. Do you want me to flag the local authorities right now? Elias asked. Not yet, I replied, staring out through the windshield into the dark, rain-soaked parking lot. I am going to let him dig the hole a little deeper. Just build the iron fence around him. Understood. Initiating the lockdown sequence now. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The relentless rain was finally beginning to slow, the heavy storm giving way to a cold, biting drizzle. Vance thought he had successfully outsmarted a weary, submissive wife. He fundamentally failed to realize he had just declared war on a woman who spent her entire adult life managing catastrophic disasters. I knew exactly how to dismantle a structural threat, and I was about to bring the hurricane straight to his front door. I drove back up my own driveway at 7 in the morning. The freezing rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating gray humidity that hung heavily over the neighborhood. I parked my tactical vehicle, leaving Titan safely resting under the watchful care of the veterinary clinic, and walked slowly toward the front door. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a home. It was a hostile environment, a beautifully decorated cage where every shadow hid a lie. I stepped into the kitchen. Vance was sitting comfortably at the massive marble island, sipping a freshly brewed espresso. When he heard my heavy boots on the floorboards, he did not flinch. He slowly turned his head, a smug, victorious smile creeping across his face. He looked me up and down, taking in my wrinkled uniform, my damp hair, and my exhausted posture. In his deeply narcissistic mind, my quiet return confirmed his ultimate dominance. He firmly believed my sudden departure the night before was nothing more than a pathetic, childish tantrum. He thought the cold reality of sleeping in a truck had broken my spirit, forcing me to crawl back to the warmth of his domain. I played the part flawlessly. I lowered my gaze, letting my shoulders slump forward, mirroring the weak, silently enduring wife I had been conditioned to play for the past 5 years. I walked past him without a single word of defiance, heading straight for the laundry room. He let out a short, mocking scoff, reveling in his perceived victory. The silence in the house was deadly, practically vibrating with his unearned arrogance. Less than 2 hours later, the doorbell rang. Before I could even reach the foyer, the door swung open, and the suffocating, powdery scent of cheap floral perfume invaded the hallway. It was Margaret. Vance's mother dragged 2 large, heavy suitcases over the threshold, her sharp, judgmental eyes immediately scanning the space for flaws. She announced loudly that she was simply dropping by for a few days to check on her precious son, but the heavy-duty measuring tape securely clutched in her right hand told a completely different story. Margaret had always viewed my home as a temporary lease until she could mold it into her own personal retirement sanctuary. "Brinley, dear," Margaret cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she stepped onto the exact spot where Vance had assaulted my dog just hours prior. "You look absolutely dreadful. Have you not showered? The entire house smells like a damp kennel." I gripped the edge of the staircase railing, forcing my facial muscles to remain entirely blank. "I just returned from a 3-week deployment, Margaret," I replied softly, playing the exhausted, defeated victim. She waved her manicured hand dismissively, completely uninterested in the reality of my labor. "Well, you really must learn to separate your little volunteer hobbies from a respectable home environment. Vance is under an immense amount of pressure right now. He is building an empire." She unspooled the yellow measuring tape with a sharp snap, stretching it across the width of my living room. "This sectional sofa has got to go. It is far too dreary and depressing. When Vance officially launches his new venture, We will need a space that reflects true luxury. Perhaps a custom velvet arrangement right here, facing the fireplace. She was actively measuring my living room. She was publicly dismantling my lifestyle, piece by piece, preparing to permanently colonize my space. I stood there, an unwanted ghost in my own house, watching a mother and son mentally redesign a life funded entirely by my stolen inheritance. By noon, the suffocating atmosphere had thickened into an unbearable psychological weight. Vance and Margaret commandeered the large oak dining table, scattering expensive embossed invitations and luxury catering menus across the polished wood. They were frantically organizing a highly exclusive guest list for the following afternoon. It was the grand debut of Vance's fictitious business empire, a lavish afternoon cocktail party designed to show off his fraudulent success and, undoubtedly, to parade his shiny new sports car to his shallow circle of friends. We need to ensure the valets park the McLaren exactly at the center of the circular driveway, Vance instructed his mother, leaning back in his chair with unbearable arrogance. It is the absolute centerpiece. It sets the tone for the investors. Of course, sweetheart, Margaret beamed, patting his hand affectionately. You deserve every ounce of this success. You have worked so incredibly hard. They completely ignored my presence as I quietly wiped down the kitchen counters with a damp cloth. Their delusional triumph was a sickening theater performance, but I needed them utterly distracted. While they loudly debated the merits of imported caviar versus artisanal cheese boards, I slid my phone out of my pocket and went to work under their very noses. Elias had sent the encrypted legal documents exactly as promised. I opened the secure file. It was a comprehensive power of attorney and a formal authorization to initiate a devastating civil lawsuit. With my back turned to the dining table, pretending to scrub a stubborn coffee stain near the sink, I digitally signed every single page. The legal trap was officially set in motion. Next, I accessed my private banking portal. Vance believed he had unfettered access to our joint checking and savings accounts, the deep pools of money I replenished every single month with my hazardous duty pay. In 3 silent, methodical taps, I liquidated every shared ledger. I transferred 100% of the liquid cash into an untouchable, secure trust fund registered solely under my maiden name. I left exactly $1.42 in the joint account, just enough to keep the automated system from flagging a sudden closure. The final strike was the most critical operation of the morning. I opened the secure portal for the national bank that held the fraudulent mortgage. I attached the forged loan documents, the time-stamped security footage proving Vance's physical location during the digital signing, and a sworn notarized affidavit declaring massive identity theft. I hit submit, sending the entire explosive package directly to the Federal Anti-Fraud Division. "Brinley!" Vance barked from the dining table, snapping his fingers in the air to get my attention. "Make sure you clear out your dirty boots from the mudroom before tomorrow afternoon. I cannot have my guests tripping over your filthy work gear. And try to make yourself look presentable for once. We have important people arriving at 2 o'clock. I slowly turned around, wiping my wet hands on a dish towel. I looked at the man who had stolen my money, abused my dog, and invited his mother to measure my house for my own funeral. "I will take care of everything, Vance," I said, my voice steady, calm, and terrifyingly obedient. "Tomorrow afternoon will be entirely unforgettable." He smirked and turned his attention back to his mother, completely blind to the guillotine blade suspended just inches above his neck. He thought he had successfully buried me beneath his towering ambition. He did not realize I had already locked the doors, poured the gasoline, and was simply waiting for the clock to strike 0. The clock struck 2 in the afternoon on the second day. The 48-hour countdown was rapidly approaching its explosive 0. My front lawn, usually a quiet stretch of green grass, had been completely overrun by a swarm of superficial parasites. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of expensive cologne and the shrill, hollow sound of fake laughter. Vance had invited everyone he considered an asset to his grand delusion. There were men in tailored linen suits, holding crystal champagne flutes, and women in designer dresses who looked at my home as if they were browsing a high-end catalog. And standing right next to the extravagant outdoor bar, making her highly public and shameless debut, was Chloe, the mistress. She was wearing a crimson silk dress that clung tightly to her frame, acting as though she were the official hostess of the afternoon. She mingled effortlessly, laughing loudly at Vance's terrible jokes, her hand resting intimately on his forearm whenever his mother was looking the other way. But Chloe was only the secondary attraction. The true centerpiece of this grotesque theater was parked right in the middle of the circular driveway. The McLaren. It was a sleek, aggressive machine painted in a blinding shade of metallic azure. The sunlight bounced off its polished curves, turning it into a brilliant beacon of fraudulent success. Vance was standing next to the driver's side door, gesturing wildly with his hands as he held court with a circle of gullible investors. He was bragging loudly, his voice carrying over the dull roar of the crowd. He spun a ridiculous tale about aggressive stock portfolios, overnight scaling strategies, and the relentless daily grind of a true entrepreneur. He patted the hood of the supercar with deep, genuine affection, treating the cold metal with infinitely more respect than he had ever shown my exhausted rescue dog. Every single word falling from his lips was a meticulously crafted lie, built entirely on the back of the $150,000 felony he had committed in my name. I was standing near the edge of the patio, remaining perfectly still in the shadows of the canvas awning. Vance caught sight of me out of the corner of his eye. His chest puffed out instantly. This was his kingdom, and he needed his subjects to witness his absolute, unquestionable authority. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers sharply in the air to cut through the chatter of his guests. The crowd slowly turned. Vance pointed a demanding finger directly at my face, a cruel, condescending smirk twisting his features. "Brinley!" he shouted, projecting his voice to ensure every single person on the lawn heard his command. "The ice buckets at the cabana are running low. Go down to the cellar and bring up 3 more bottles of the vintage Pinot Noir. And be quick about it. We have highly important guests waiting." It was a deliberate, calculated public humiliation. He wanted to reduce the woman who paid for the very ground he stood on to the status of an obedient, silent servant. He wanted to cement his dominance in front of his mistress and his shallow peers. I did not nod. I did not scurry away to the wine cellar to fetch his drinks. I simply turned my back to him and walked deep into the house. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and headed straight for the master bedroom. When I re-emerged exactly 10 minutes later, the dull murmur of the party outside suddenly died. The silence spread like a fast-moving shockwave from the patio doorway all the way to the edge of the driveway. I stepped out into the afternoon sun. I was no longer wearing the baggy, exhausted clothes of a defeated wife. I was dressed in my full, immaculate tactical uniform. My heavy black boots were polished to a mirror shine. My utility belt was securely fastened. The dark navy fabric of my tactical jacket bore the official high-visibility insignias of the Apex Crisis Response Initiative, and walking in perfect, disciplined synchronization right beside my left leg was Titan. I had retrieved him from the veterinary clinic earlier that morning. He was no longer shivering or covered in toxic mud. He stood tall, his chest broad, proudly wearing his heavy-duty canine honor collar adorned with the gleaming brass tags of his official search and rescue certifications. We did not stop to serve wine. We did not acknowledge the frantic whispering rippling through the crowd. I gripped Titan's heavy leash, and together, we marched straight down the center of the patio steps. The sea of tailored suits and silk dresses instinctively parted before us. Chloe stared at me, her arrogant smile freezing instantly on her glossy lips. Margaret dropped her cocktail napkin, her jaw going entirely slack. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, my posture perfectly straight, radiating the cold, hardened authority of a commanding officer walking through an unsecured civilian sector. I did not blink. I walked right past Vance, completely ignoring his sudden, furious stuttering. I stopped at the very edge of the grass, planting my boots firmly between the roaring party and the quiet street. I checked my heavy field watch. Right on cue, a deafening, high-pitched screech of heavy air brakes violently shattered the afternoon air. The ground literally vibrated beneath our feet. A massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck, painted in aggressive, warning stripes of industrial yellow and black, reversed forcefully up the street. It did not slow down to ask for directions or permission. It swung wide, its massive dual tires crushing the edges of Margaret's freshly planted flower beds, and backed forcefully into the driveway. The heavy steel rear bumper came to a jarring, hissing halt just 3 feet away from the polished nose of the metallic azure McLaren. It completely blocked the only exit route. The engine of the tow truck rumbled like a waking beast. Vance's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. The vein in his neck pulsed furiously against his collar. He shoved his way through his bewildered guests, throwing his arms up in the air, utterly convinced this was some pathetic mistake made by an incompetent driver, or perhaps a tasteless prank orchestrated by a jealous rival. He stormed aggressively toward the massive yellow truck, hurling loud, arrogant threats at the dark, tinted windows of the cab, completely unaware that the 48-hour timer had just hit 0 and the bomb was about to detonate. The heavy steel doors of the commercial tow truck swung open with a loud, metallic groan that cut through the remaining chatter on the lawn. A burly asset recovery agent wearing grease-stained denim and thick leather work gloves stepped down onto the manicured concrete. But he was not acting alone. Emerging from the passenger side of the cab and the unmarked black sedan that had silently pulled up right behind the truck were 2 tall, stern-looking men. They were not wearing the bright yellow safety vests of repo men. They wore crisp, dark suits, their suit jackets pushed back just enough to reveal the heavy silver badges of county sheriffs clipped securely to their leather belts. The lead detective gripped a thick stack of legal documents attached to a heavy-duty clipboard. The top page prominently featured the massive, unmistakable red ink stamp of a federal circuit court judge. Vance puffed out his chest, stepping squarely in front of the McLaren, his face a twisted mask of offended privilege. He was still entirely convinced he possessed the upper hand in this situation. He pointed his finger aggressively at the lead detective, completely misreading the severity of the badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "You have exactly 10 seconds to back that ugly piece of scrap metal out of my driveway before I call the mayor directly," Vance barked, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to project authority over the idling diesel engine. "This is a private, highly exclusive corporate event. You are trespassing on my property, and whatever clerical error your incompetent dispatch office made is not my problem. Move the truck right now." The lead detective did not even blink. He did not slow his pace, nor did he offer a polite customer service smile. He walked straight up to Vance, stopping a mere 2 feet away, completely invading his personal space. The detective raised the clipboard, holding the court order squarely in front of Vance's flushed face. "Vance Diaz?" the detective asked. His voice was not a question. It was a heavy, immovable concrete block. It boomed across the silent lawn, amplified by the sudden hush of the terrified guests. "I am the owner of this estate, yes," Vance retorted, though his arrogant posture wavered slightly as he finally registered the red judicial seal. "You are not the owner of this vehicle, sir," the detective stated loudly, turning slightly so his voice carried across the driveway, ensuring every single guest heard his next words with crystal clarity. "By order of the Federal District Court, this vehicle is being immediately impounded. It is being officially seized as direct, material evidence in an active, ongoing criminal investigation regarding massive financial fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the forgery of federal bank loan documents." The word fraud echoed off the brick facade of the house. The phrase identity theft dropped like a heavy anvil onto the pristine lawn. The asset recovery agent did not wait for Vance to process the legal nightmare. He hit a button on his remote, and the heavy steel winch on the back of the tow truck began to hum. A thick steel cable unspooled, dragging a heavy metal claw across the concrete toward the undercarriage of the magnificent metallic azure supercar. Total, suffocating panic finally breached the walls of Vance's delusion. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. He stumbled backward away from the detective, his eyes darting wildly around the crowd. He instinctively looked for an ally, someone to validate his crumbling reality. His desperate gaze locked onto Chloe. The mistress was standing near the edge of the stone pathway, still clutching her expensive champagne flute. But Chloe was not a loyal partner. She was an opportunistic shark. Her entire business model was built on attaching herself to wealthy, successful men. The moment the detective uttered the words financial fraud and asset seizure, the complex mental arithmetic in her head instantly calculated his true net worth. She looked at the heavy tow truck. She looked at the federal warrant, and then she looked at Vance's pale, sweating face. She realized in a fraction of a second that the man she had been sleeping with was not a rising venture capitalist. He was a broke, desperate criminal drowning in catastrophic debt. Without saying a single word of comfort, without offering even a fleeting glance of sympathy, Chloe swiftly placed her crystal glass down on a nearby cocktail table. She tightened her grip on her designer leather handbag, spun on her stiletto heels, and power-walked straight across the grass toward the street. She did not look back. She abandoned the sinking ship with the brutal, calculated efficiency of a seasoned grifter, leaving Vance completely isolated in front of his audience. Seeing the mistress flee triggered a primal, irrational reaction in Margaret. The mother could not comprehend the spectacular destruction of her son's carefully constructed empire. Her mind simply rejected the reality of the handcuffs and the court orders. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that sounded like a wounded bird. "Stop it! Stop touching his car!" Margaret screamed at the top of her lungs. She dropped her plate of artisanal cheese, ignoring the expensive crackers scattering across the grass, and sprinted recklessly toward the tow truck. She threw her arms out wide, attempting to wedge her body between the heavy steel winch and the front bumper of the McLaren. "You cannot do this! My son is a brilliant businessman. You are ruining his massive launch party. I demand you unhook that chain this instant." The second sheriff, who had remained quietly observant near the sedan, moved with terrifying practiced speed. He lunged forward, grabbing Margaret firmly by her upper arm and yanking her safely away from the moving mechanical winch. Before she could even draw a breath to scream again, the sharp, distinctive metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping open echoed sharply. The deputy held the gleaming silver restraints directly in front of her face, his voice dropping into a deadly, uncompromising warning. "Ma'am, if you step toward that active recovery equipment one more time, or if you attempt to physically obstruct a court-ordered federal seizure again, I will put these cuffs on your wrists, drag you to the back of my cruiser, and officially charge you with assaulting a peace officer and resisting a lawful execution of justice. Step back immediately." The sheer terror of facing actual jail time instantly silenced her hysteria. Margaret gasped, her eyes wide with horror as she stared at the handcuffs. She clamped her mouth shut, taking 3 rapid steps backward, her entire body shaking violently as she helplessly watched the steel hooks lock securely onto the axles of the sports car. The atmosphere among the party guests underwent a brutal, instantaneous transformation. Just 30 minutes prior, these people had been sipping free wine and eagerly hanging on to Vance's every word, hoping to secure a piece of his fake startup wealth. Now the admiration had completely evaporated, replaced by a toxic, eager, morbid curiosity. They were not friends. They were an audience watching a spectacular train wreck. The polite whispers morphed into loud, vicious gossip. Across the lawn, perfectly manicured hands reached into expensive purses and tailored suit pockets. Dozens of high-resolution smartphone cameras were simultaneously raised into the air. The soft, synthetic clicking sounds of camera shutters firing filled the air. They were recording everything. They were zooming in on the tow truck dragging the symbol of his fake wealth up the metal ramp. They were capturing the humiliating footage of Margaret cowering away from the police. They were filming the total, absolute annihilation of Vance's digital persona. By sunset, this disastrous scene would be uploaded to every single social media platform, entirely destroying whatever pitiful reputation he had left in the city. Vance spun around in tight, erratic circles, completely trapped in a nightmare he could not wake up from. The hydraulic lift of the tow truck groaned loudly as it hoisted the heavy car into the air. He was losing his mind. His breathing became shallow and ragged. In a final, utterly delusional act of absolute desperation, his wild eyes frantically searched the perimeter until they locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly still at the edge of the grass, Titan sitting obediently at my side, observing the chaos with the cold, detached silence of a stone statue. Vance stormed through the crowd of recording guests, his face contorted into an ugly, pathetic mask of rage and raw panic. He stopped just a few feet away from me, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Fix this!" he roared, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate screech that made several guests physically recoil. "Brinley, do you hear me? Fix this right now. Tell them this is a massive mistake. Call your bank. Transfer the funds from our joint savings account and pay these thugs whatever ridiculous fee they are demanding. You have the money. Pay them off and get my car back down here before my entire launch is ruined." He was standing in the ruins of his own arrogant creation, publicly exposed as a massive fraud, his mistress long gone, his mother threatened with arrest, and his stolen property being chained to a flatbed truck. Yet, in his profoundly broken, narcissistic reality, he still truly believed I was simply a tool to be used, a bottomless wallet obligated to rescue him from the consequences of his own felonies. He thought he could still scream orders and I would blindly obey. He had absolutely no idea that the final trap had yet to be sprung. Vance's desperate, high-pitched demands hung in the humid air, pathetic and hollow. He was begging the very woman he had mentally and emotionally abused for years to save him from a prison cell he had built with his own 2 hands. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I reached inside the deep interior pocket of my heavy tactical jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents. I did not hand them to him politely. With a swift, forceful motion, I slammed the heavy manila envelope directly into the center of his chest. Reflexively, his hands came up to catch it, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. The thick stack of papers slipped out, the stark black text entirely visible to anyone standing close enough to see. The first page was a legally binding unilateral divorce petition, filed and stamped by the county clerk. Directly beneath it was a massive, highly detailed dossier containing every single piece of financial evidence, bank routing numbers, and forged signatures that I had successfully transmitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation just hours prior. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, entirely closing the distance between us. I looked straight into his wide, panicked eyes, stripping away the last remaining shred of his fragile ego. "This house is mine," I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that sliced through the murmurs of the crowd. "This car is evidence, and you are just a criminal waiting for an arrest warrant." At that exact moment, the commercial tow truck shifted into drive. The massive diesel engine roared, vibrating the ground beneath our boots, and began to pull the heavy metal beast out of the driveway. As the blinding azure paint of the McLaren disappeared down the suburban street, taking Vance's entire fabricated identity with it, his legs completely gave out. He collapsed hard onto the damp concrete driveway, his tailored trousers soaking up the muddy puddles left behind by the morning rain. He buried his face in his hands and let out a raw, agonizing scream. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was the pathetic, shattering wail of a narcissist who had been violently stripped of every single illusion. He thrashed blindly, surrounded by dozens of flashing smartphone cameras, completely ruined in front of the exact audience he had tried to impress. I did not stay to watch him weep. I simply turned away, my boots crunching softly against the gravel. I patted my leg once. Titan fell into a perfect heel right beside me. We walked away from the screaming man, away from the horrified mother-in-law, and away from a life that no longer belonged to me. I climbed into the driver's seat of my command vehicle, secured Titan in the back, and pressed my foot firmly onto the gas pedal. I drove away from the chaos, leaving his desperate screams trapped in the rearview mirror forever. 6 months later, the suffocating humidity of Portland was nothing more than a distant memory. I was sitting on a weathered wooden bench on the front porch of a small, quiet coastal cabin overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The crisp, salty breeze rushed over the wooden deck, carrying the rhythmic, soothing sound of crashing waves. There were no arguments. There was no walking on eggshells. There was only a profound, immovable peace. I brought a hot cup of black coffee to my lips, letting the warmth spread through my chest as I scrolled lazily through the morning news feed on my phone. A small headline from a local Portland digital newspaper caught my eye. Vance Diaz had officially pled guilty. The federal judge had shown absolutely no leniency, handing down a strict sentence of 3 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He was gone, locked away in a concrete cell, entirely stripped of the luxury he had tried to steal from me. I locked the screen of my phone and set it down on the wooden side table. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath of the clean ocean air. Sprawled out across the sun-drenched wooden planks at my feet was Titan. He was no longer a stressed, exhausted rescue dog. His thick fur was brushed and shining under the golden morning sunlight. He let out a soft, contented sigh and slowly wagged his heavy tail as I reached down to gently massage behind his ears. It was a beautiful, quiet morning, marking the perfect beginning of a new life where toxic, manipulative people would never again be granted the privilege of stepping through my front door. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned at the beginning, our channel has been entirely demonetized by YouTube, and we currently have no operating budget. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the direct PayPal link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video. That single dollar gives us the budget to pay our hardworking staff so they can provide for their families and continue creating even better stories to serve you. Thank you for your time, your incredible support, and your wonderful company.